The laughter began before the single dad had even stepped out of his rusty truck. It was sharp, careless laughter, the kind that could make a grown man feel smaller than he already did. His old blue pickup rolled into the polished parking lot of one of the most powerful technology companies in America, its faded paint covered with scratches, its hood slightly dented, and one side mirror held together with black tape. At the entrance stood the company's young CEO, Vivian Calloway, surrounded by executives in expensive suits, and the moment she saw the truck, she smiled with open amusement. What she did not know was that the man climbing out of that battered vehicle had once stood beside her father in an empty warehouse with nothing but a borrowed toolbox, a broken coffee machine, and a dream. She did not know that the company she now proudly called hers had been built by two friends, and one of those founders was the humble single father standing quietly in front of her. If you believe kindness matters more than wealth, that forgiveness can heal what pride destroys, and that people deserve second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you can remain part of our family and our community. The man's name was Everett Hayes, and at 48 years old, he had learned not to judge a person by the way they looked at him. He had spent the last 11 years raising his daughter, Marin, alone after losing his wife to a sudden illness that left an empty chair at their kitchen table and a silence in their home that never completely disappeared. Everett worked with his hands now. He repaired machinery, restored old engines, and occasionally fixed specialized equipment for businesses that still valued experience over appearances. His old truck had belonged to his late wife's father, and Everett had kept it because selling it had never felt right. It was unreliable, noisy, and embarrassing in wealthy neighborhoods, but it had carried him through some of the hardest years of his life. That morning, he had driven it to Callaway Systems because he had been asked to inspect a mechanical failure in a prototype manufacturing unit. He expected to enter through the service entrance, finish his work, and leave before lunch. He never expected to be publicly humiliated by the woman whose father had once called him his best friend. Vivian Calloway had inherited the company after her father, Harrison Calloway, retired from active leadership following a serious health crisis. At 36, Vivian was brilliant, disciplined, ambitious, and painfully determined to prove that she deserved the position. She had grown up surrounded by luxury, but she had also grown up hearing stories about how her father had built the company from nothing. What she had never understood was that Harrison had not built it alone. For years, he had carefully preserved a private collection of old photographs, letters, notebooks, and early business records that remained locked away in his study. Vivian had seen them, but she had never paid much attention. To her, the company's history was mostly about her father's genius and determination. She had never bothered to ask who the other young man standing beside him in those faded photographs was. That morning, as Everett closed the door of his truck, one of Vivian's executives glanced at the vehicle and quietly joked that the company's parking lot had apparently become a salvage yard. Several people laughed. Everett heard them but said nothing. He simply picked up his worn tool case and walked toward the entrance. Vivian looked him over and asked if he was the contractor sent to repair the equipment. Everett calmly confirmed that he was. She glanced at his work boots, faded jacket, and battered case before looking back toward his truck. Her expression carried the kind of judgment that needed no words. She made a dismissive remark about how unusual it was for someone repairing high-end equipment to arrive in something that looked ready for a museum. The people around her laughed again. Everett gave a small, tired smile and replied that sometimes old things worked better than people expected. Vivian barely heard him. She was already walking away. What Vivian did not see was what happened inside Everett's chest. He had spent years teaching his daughter that dignity was not something other people could give or take away. He remembered saying those words to Marin when classmates had mocked her for wearing second-hand clothes after her mother died. He remembered telling her that being poor was not shameful, refusing to let grief turn their home into a place of bitterness. Yet now he was standing in front of a company he had helped create, watching people laugh at the only vehicle he could afford to keep running. For a brief moment, he wondered whether he should simply leave. But then he thought about the employees who depended on that factory and the thousands of families whose livelihoods were connected to the company. He picked up his tools and went inside. Within an hour, Everett had discovered something that several highly paid engineers had missed. The prototype machine was not failing because of the software, as everyone had assumed. A small mechanical alignment problem had been creating vibration through the entire system, gradually damaging components that were far more expensive than the original fault. Everett recognized the problem because he remembered helping Harrison design the earliest version of the same mechanism decades earlier. He made the adjustment, tested the system, and watched the machine begin operating smoothly again. The engineers stared at the readings in disbelief. One of them asked how he had known where to look. Everett simply explained that machines often told you what was wrong if you stopped trying to make them behave and started listening to them. The news reached Vivian quickly. She came into the testing area expecting to find another technical report, but instead found Everett standing beside the machine while several engineers examined his work. For the first time, she looked at him with something other than amusement. She asked where he had learned his skills. Everett hesitated before saying that he had learned most of them from working beside a very stubborn man named Harrison Calloway. Vivian froze. The room suddenly felt different. She asked him what he meant. Everett reached into his worn tool case and pulled out an old brass measuring instrument with initials engraved along the handle. Harrison's initials were beside his own. Vivian stared at it. Everett explained that he and Harrison had met when they were young engineers working out of a rented warehouse. Neither had money. Neither had connections. They had spent years developing a mechanical system that eventually became the foundation of Calloway Systems. Harrison had been the public face of the company after investors arrived, while Everett had remained focused on engineering and manufacturing. When the company expanded, Everett stepped away because his wife had become seriously ill and his daughter needed him. Harrison had promised that Everett would always have a place in the company, but Everett never returned. He wanted to raise Marin without allowing business ambition to consume the years he could never get back. Vivian felt the color leave her face. She asked why she had never heard his name. Everett told her that Harrison had probably mentioned him many times, but people often remember the person standing behind the podium and forget the person holding the blueprint. Then he showed her an old photograph. In it, a younger Harrison stood beside a younger Everett in front of a tiny warehouse. Behind them was a hand-painted sign bearing the first name they had ever given their company. Vivian recognized the building immediately. It was the same warehouse featured in the company's official history. Her embarrassment was immediate, but Everett did not enjoy watching her struggle. He had no desire to punish her. He simply told her that she had made a mistake that morning, but mistakes did not have to become identities. Those words struck her harder than any angry accusation could have. Vivian remembered how often she had judged employees based on clothing, education, accents, and backgrounds. She had convinced herself that high standards meant never accepting weakness. Somewhere along the way, however, she had confused high standards with superiority. Then came the second revelation. Harrison had left Vivian a sealed letter with instructions that it be opened only when she was ready to understand the company's true history. She had ignored it for months because she had been too busy proving herself. Now she finally opened it. Inside was a handwritten note explaining that Everett was not merely an early employee or consultant. He was Harrison's co-founder, the man who had designed the first working prototype, the friend who had sacrificed his ownership position to protect his family, and the person Harrison trusted more than anyone in business. The letter ended with a simple message: the company will survive without money, but it will not survive without humility. Vivian broke down quietly. She found Everett outside near his old truck. For the first time that day, there was no audience, no executives, and no polished corporate image to protect. She apologized without excuses. She admitted that she had judged him because of a truck, his clothes, and the life she assumed he lived. She confessed that she had been so afraid of failing her father that she had started treating everyone beneath her as though they were threats to her success. Everett listened. Then he told her something she never forgot. He said that his greatest regret was not leaving the company. It was believing for too many years that people had to earn the right to be treated with respect. He had learned, especially after losing his wife, that kindness should never depend on someone's usefulness. Vivian cried as she told him she wanted to make things right. She did not simply offer him money. She offered him a seat on the company's advisory board and asked him to help rebuild the company culture her father had once imagined. Everett initially refused. He had spent years protecting his quiet life with Maren, and he did not want another executive title. But when he learned that several young employees were struggling under the same harsh culture Vivian had created, he agreed to help, not for the company's prestige, but for the people inside it. Over the following months, everything began to change. Vivian started visiting the factory floor instead of remaining behind her office desk. She learned the names of employees she had previously walked past. She listened to maintenance workers, assistants, technicians, and drivers. She stopped asking what college someone attended before asking what they could contribute. And every time she saw Everett arrive in his rusty truck, she smiled instead of looking away. One afternoon, Maren visited the company for the first time. She was nervous because she had grown up hearing about the company but had never imagined that her father had helped create it. When she stepped into the main lobby, she saw a large historical display that had recently been installed. At the center was an old photograph of two young men standing in front of a tiny warehouse. One was Harrison Calloway. The other was Everett Hayes. Underneath the photograph was a simple inscription, "Two founders. One dream. Built through friendship, sacrifice, and perseverance." Maren looked at her father with tears in her eyes. Everett smiled, embarrassed by the attention. Vivian stood nearby and told Maren that her father had taught the company something more valuable than engineering. He had taught them that a person's worth could never be measured by what they drove, wore, owned, or earned. Everett looked across the lobby at the photograph and remembered the young man he had once been, the friend he had lost, the wife he had loved, and the daughter who had given him a reason to keep moving forward. He realized that the rusty truck had never been something to be ashamed of. It had carried him through grief, poverty, fatherhood, sacrifice, and finally back to a place he had once believed he had left forever. Vivian eventually asked him why he had never told anyone that he was one of the founders. Everett looked at his daughter, then at the employees moving through the building, and simply said that he had never needed a wall with his name on it to know what he had accomplished. His daughter was his greatest achievement. Everything else was just history. Before leaving that afternoon, Everett climbed into his old truck. Vivian walked over and handed him a small wooden box. Inside was Harrison's original company badge from the early warehouse days, along with a handwritten note saying that some founders build companies, while others build the people who keep them alive. Everett held the badge for a long moment. Then he looked at Vivian and smiled. The rusty truck started with its familiar rough rumble, and for once, nobody laughed. Employees standing near the entrance watched as Everett drove away beneath the bright afternoon sun. Vivian remained there until the truck disappeared down the road, understanding that the most valuable lesson her father had ever left her was not hidden in a business contract, a financial report, or a corporate strategy. It had been sitting in an old truck all along. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, tell us in the comments, have you ever judged someone by their appearance and later discovered that their story was completely different from what you believed? Sometimes the person we overlook is carrying a history, a sacrifice, and a strength we could never see from the outside. Everett never changed his truck. He never needed to. The scratches remained. The paint stayed faded. The mirror was still held together with tape. But from that day forward, whenever people saw that rusty old pickup arriving at Callaway Systems, they no longer saw something broken. They saw a reminder that greatness does not always arrive in a luxury car, success does not always wear an expensive suit, and the people who deserve our respect are not always the ones standing beneath the brightest lights. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who helped build it. Sometimes forgiveness opens doors that pride keeps locked. And sometimes, the greatest second chance begins with something as simple as looking at another human being and choosing kindness before judgment.